The humid Manila morning carried the scent of street food and exhaust fumes as Manny Pacquiao stepped out of his black SUV near the Divisoria market. He had come to visit a local community center where he often distributed aid to struggling families, but something unexpected caught his attention. Across the crowded street, beneath a faded tarpaulin stretched between two concrete posts, sat an elderly man with weathered hands, carefully arranging a small collection of worn books. The man's clothes were patched and faded, his sandals held together with wire, yet there was something dignified in the way he sat cross-legged on a piece of cardboard. Manny's security team urged him to move toward the community center, but the champion boxer found himself frozen in place. There was something achingly familiar about the man's profile, the gentle way he handled each book as if it were precious. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift shelter, and as the elderly man looked up to greet a potential customer, Manny's heart nearly stopped. Those kind eyes, that patient smile, the same expression that had once looked down at a hungry 8-year-old boy with such compassion and understanding. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting open. Manny remembered sitting in a cramped classroom in General Santos City, his stomach growling so loudly that other children would turn to stare. He remembered the shame of having no lunch money, no packed meal, nothing but the gnawing emptiness that made it impossible to concentrate on lessons. But most vividly, he remembered the gentle voice that would call him to the front of the class, not for punishment, but for something far more precious than any grade or recognition. Angelo Santos had been more than just a teacher at Saavedra Saway Elementary School. He had been the one adult who noticed when young Manny's eyes would glaze over from hunger, who understood that an empty stomach made learning impossible. Without fanfare or announcement, Angelo would quietly share his own modest lunch with the boy, breaking his rice and dried fish into 2 portions, always insisting that Manny take the larger share. Those shared meals had been lifelines, moments of dignity in a childhood marked by poverty and struggle. Now, 30 years later, the roles seemed cruelly reversed. The boy who had once depended on his teacher's kindness had become one of the most successful athletes in the world, while the man who had shown such generosity sat homeless on a Manila street corner. Manny's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, his mind racing with questions and a growing sense of urgency. How had this happened? How long had Angelo been living this way? And why hadn't anyone reached out to let him know? The irony was not lost on Manny as he stood there in his expensive clothes, surrounded by bodyguards and luxury vehicles, while the man who had once fed him now appeared to be struggling for his next meal. The weight of gratitude and responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, mixed with a deep shame that he had lost touch with someone who had played such a crucial role in his survival. This chance encounter felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a calling, a moment that would demand everything he had learned about loyalty, humility, and giving back to those who had lifted him up when he needed it most. Manny's mind drifted back to those difficult days in General Santos City, when his family's small house seemed to shrink a little more each day under the weight of poverty. His father Rosalio worked sporadically as a laborer, and his mother Dionysia sold cigarettes and candies on the street. But their combined income barely covered the most basic necessities. School supplies were a luxury they couldn't afford, and packed lunches were simply out of the question. Most days, Manny would arrive at Saavedra Saway Elementary with nothing but hope that somehow the gnawing hunger wouldn't distract him too much from his lessons. The other children seemed to sense his situation, though none were cruel about it. They would unwrap their modest meals of rice and vegetables, or occasionally a piece of fried fish, while Manny would pretend to be busy organizing his few school supplies or studying his worn textbooks. The shame was almost unbearable, especially during those long afternoon classes when his stomach would growl audibly, causing him to press his arms against his midsection in a futile attempt to muffle the sound. He had become an expert at hiding his hunger, at smiling and participating in class discussions, even when dizziness from lack of food made it difficult to focus. It was during one particularly difficult week, when his family had been surviving on rice and salt for 3 consecutive days, that Angelo Santos first approached him. The teacher had noticed how Manny's usual enthusiasm for learning had dimmed, how the boy's eyes seemed to lose focus during lessons, and how he would sometimes rest his head on his desk during breaks. Instead of calling attention to the situation, or making Manny feel singled out, Angelo had simply walked over during lunch period and sat down beside him with his own simple meal of rice, dried fish, and a small portion of vegetables. Without any explanation or fanfare, Angelo had begun breaking his food into 2 portions, pushing the larger share toward Manny while continuing to talk about their morning math lesson. The gesture was so natural, so devoid of pity or condescension, that it felt like the most normal thing in the world. Angelo spoke about fractions and multiplication tables while they ate together, treating the shared meal as if it was simply an extension of their classroom learning. For Manny, it was the first time in weeks that food had tasted like more than mere sustenance. It tasted like kindness, like dignity, like hope. This ritual continued for months, becoming a quiet cornerstone of Manny's elementary school experience. Angelo never made a big show of their shared lunches, never drew attention to what he was doing, and never made Manny feel like a charity case. Instead, he treated these moments as opportunities for one-on-one tutoring, helping Manny with difficult concepts while ensuring the boy had enough energy to learn. Sometimes Angelo would bring an extra piece of fruit or a small, sweet treat, always presenting it as if he had simply packed too much food and needed help finishing it. The impact of these gestures extended far beyond mere nutrition. Angelo was teaching Manny about generosity, about the quiet dignity of helping others without seeking recognition or praise. He was showing the boy that education and compassion could go hand in hand, that true teaching meant caring for the whole student, not just their academic performance. Years later, when Manny would establish his own foundation and dedicate himself to helping impoverished children, he would trace the roots of that calling back to those shared lunches with Angelo Santos. Now, standing on this Manila street corner, Manny realized that those lessons in generosity had shaped not just his character, but his entire approach to success and wealth. Angelo had planted seeds of empathy and social responsibility that had grown into Manny's lifelong commitment to giving back to his community. The teacher had never asked for anything in return, had never sought credit or recognition for his kindness, and had probably never imagined that the hungry boy he fed would one day become famous enough to repay that debt. But Manny remembered everything, and the sight of his former teacher in such difficult circumstances felt like a test of everything Angelo had taught him about compassion and loyalty. Manny took a deep breath and began walking slowly across the busy street, his security team scrambling to keep pace while maintaining a respectful distance. Each step felt weighted with the gravity of the moment, as if he were crossing not just a road, but a bridge between his past and present. The sounds of Manila traffic faded into background noise as he focused entirely on the figure of Angelo Santos, who remained absorbed in arranging his small collection of books. Completely unaware that his former student was approaching, Manny's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and overwhelming gratitude that threatened to spill over into tears. As he drew closer, Manny could see the titles of the books more clearly, worn copies of Filipino literature, mathematics textbooks, and children's stories, all carefully organized despite their obviously second-hand condition. Angelo was still teaching, even here on the street, still believing in the power of education to transform lives. The sight of those weathered hands, the same ones that had once broken bread with a hungry child, now carefully tending to books that might help other children learn, struck Manny as profoundly beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Angelo looked up as a shadow fell across his makeshift bookstand, and for a moment, confusion flickered across his weathered features. The man approaching him was clearly someone of importance, given the entourage and expensive clothing, but there was something familiar about his face, something that tugged at distant memories. Angelo's eyes, still sharp despite his age, studied Manny's features with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades observing and remembering students. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over the horizon, and Angelo's mouth opened slightly in disbelief. Manny stopped just a few feet away and slowly removed his sunglasses, allowing his former teacher to see his face clearly. The years had changed him dramatically from the skinny, hungry boy who had once sat in Angelo's classroom, but his eyes remained the same, still carrying that mixture of determination and humility that Angelo remembered so well. For several long seconds, neither man spoke, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of this unexpected reunion and the stark contrast between their current circumstances. Finally, Manny spoke, his voice soft and filled with emotion that he made no attempt to hide. He addressed Angelo with the same respectful tone he had used as a child, acknowledging not just their teacher-student relationship, but the profound impact Angelo had made on his life. The words came slowly at first, as if Manny were afraid that speaking too quickly might somehow break the spell of this moment. might cause his beloved teacher to disappear like a mirage in the Manila heat. Angelo's response was immediate and characteristic of the man Manny remembered. He smiled with genuine warmth and began to stand, brushing dust from his worn clothes with the same dignity he had always carried. Despite his circumstances, despite the obvious hardships he had endured, Angelo's first concern was for his former student's well-being, asking about Manny's family, his health, his happiness. The teacher's priorities hadn't changed. He was still more interested in nurturing others than in dwelling on his own difficulties, still embodying the selfless spirit that had made such a lasting impression on the young boy he had once fed and encouraged. As they sat together on a nearby bench that Manny had quietly asked his security team to clear, Angelo began to share the story of how his life had taken such a difficult turn. His voice remained steady and dignified, even as he recounted a series of misfortunes that had gradually stripped away everything he had worked for during his decades as an educator. Manny listened with growing dismay and admiration, struck by how Angelo spoke of his hardships without bitterness or self-pity, maintaining the same gentle wisdom that had made him such an effective teacher. The troubles had begun 5 years earlier when Angelo's wife, Esperanza, had been diagnosed with a serious kidney condition that required expensive ongoing treatment. As a retired public school teacher, Angelo's pension was modest, barely enough to cover their basic living expenses under normal circumstances. When medical bills began mounting, he had first dipped into their small savings, then sold their few valuable possessions, and finally mortgaged their small house in General Santos City. For 2 years, he had managed to keep up with both the medical expenses and the mortgage payments by taking on tutoring jobs and selling textbooks, but it was a losing battle against an increasingly expensive treatment regimen. Esperanza had passed away 18 months ago, but not before the couple had lost their home to foreclosure. Angelo spoke of his wife's final days with tender love, describing how she had worried more about his future than her own suffering, how she had made him promise to continue teaching in whatever way he could. After her death, Angelo had found himself not only grieving, but also homeless, with debts that consumed what little remained of his pension each month. He had moved to Manila hoping to find better opportunities for work, but discovered that age discrimination made it nearly impossible for a 72-year-old man to find steady employment. The bookselling had started as a way to earn a few pesos while staying connected to education, his lifelong passion. Angelo would visit second-hand bookstores and garage sales, carefully selecting educational materials that he could resell to students and parents who couldn't afford new textbooks. It wasn't much of a living, barely enough for 1 meal a day and occasional shelter in cheap boarding houses, but it allowed him to maintain some dignity and purpose. He spoke of the satisfaction he felt when a struggling student found an affordable textbook at his stand, how it reminded him of his classroom days when he could see knowledge taking root in young minds. What struck Manny most powerfully was how Angelo had adapted to his circumstances without losing his essential character. Even while homeless, he had continued to help other people whenever possible, sharing his meager earnings with families who seemed even more desperate than himself. He had organized informal reading sessions for street children, using his small collection of storybooks to provide education and hope to kids who had no access to formal schooling. Angelo had turned his street corner into an unofficial classroom, proving that a true teacher's calling transcends physical buildings and institutional structures. As Angelo finished his story, Manny felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. There was deep sadness for his teacher's suffering, anger at a system that had failed such a dedicated educator, and overwhelming gratitude that fate had brought them together again. But more than anything, there was a profound sense of purpose, a clarity about what needed to happen next. Angelo had once fed him when he was hungry. Now it was Manny's turn to provide sustenance, not just for Angelo's body, but for his dignity and his future. The conversation had drawn a small crowd of curious onlookers who recognized Manny, but he barely noticed them. His entire focus was on the man sitting beside him, the teacher who had shown him that true wealth lay not in material possessions, but in the generosity of spirit that compels us to share what we have with those who need it most. Angelo had given him far more than food during those school lunch periods. He had given him a blueprint for how to live with purpose and compassion, lessons that had guided every major decision in Manny's adult life. Manny's mind raced as he processed everything Angelo had shared, but one memory kept surfacing with crystal clarity. He remembered a conversation from his final day at Saavedra Saway Elementary, when he had approached Angelo's desk after the last bell had rung and the other students had rushed out to begin their summer vacation. Young Manny had wanted to thank his teacher for all the shared meals, for the patient tutoring, for the kindness that had made school bearable during the most difficult period of his childhood. He had been too young to articulate the depth of his gratitude, but he had made a solemn promise that day, spoken with the earnest intensity that only children possess. He had told Angelo that someday, when he grew up and became successful, he would find a way to repay all the kindness he had received. Angelo had smiled and gently told him that the best way to repay kindness was to pass it on to others who needed it. But young Manny had insisted that he would do both, help others and also take care of the teacher who had taken care of him. Angelo had ruffled his hair affectionately and told him to focus on his studies and his dreams. But Manny had never forgotten that promise, even as the years passed and life took him far from General Santos City. Now, sitting beside his former teacher on this Manila street corner, Manny realized that this moment represented more than just a chance encounter. It was an opportunity to honor that childhood promise, to demonstrate that success meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift up the people who had helped make it possible. The 8-year-old boy who had once depended on Angelo's generosity had grown into a man with the resources to ensure that his teacher would never want for anything again, and the symmetry of that transformation felt almost divinely orchestrated. Manny began to speak, his voice growing stronger and more determined with each word. He told Angelo about the foundation he had established, about the schools he had built, about the thousands of children who were receiving education and meals because of programs he had funded. But more importantly, he explained how every act of generosity in his adult life could be traced back to the lessons Angelo had taught him about sharing and compassion. The teacher had planted seeds that had grown into a forest of charitable works, and it was time for Angelo to see the full harvest of his early investment in a hungry child's future. Angelo listened with growing amazement, his eyes filling with tears as he realized the profound impact his simple acts of kindness had made. He had always believed in the power of education to transform lives, but seeing the evidence of that transformation sitting beside him was overwhelming. The boy he had fed had not only achieved incredible success, but had used that success to feed thousands of others, creating a ripple effect of generosity that stretched far beyond anything Angelo could have imagined when he first shared his lunch with a hungry student. But Manny wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to making things happen quickly and efficiently. Within minutes, he had arranged for Angelo to be taken to a comfortable hotel, had scheduled medical appointments to ensure his health was properly cared for, and had begun the process of finding him permanent housing. More importantly, he had started planning something that would honor Angelo's lifelong dedication to education while ensuring his financial security for the rest of his life. As they sat together watching the Manila traffic flow past, both men understood that this moment represented a completion of sorts, a closing of a circle that had begun decades earlier in a humble classroom. Angelo had given freely when he had little to spare, never expecting anything in return, and now that generosity was being returned, multiplied beyond his wildest dreams. For Manny, this reunion felt like coming home, like finally being able to fulfill the most important promise of his childhood, and demonstrate that true success was measured not by personal achievements, but by the ability to honor and care for those who had made those achievements possible. Over the following days, Manny threw himself into planning with the same intensity and focus that had made him a champion in the boxing ring. He assembled a team of his most trusted advisors, including his foundation's directors, his financial managers, and his personal assistants, giving them a single mandate: create a comprehensive plan that would not only address Angelo's immediate needs, but also honor his legacy as an educator in a way that would inspire others and create lasting positive change. The urgency in Manny's voice made it clear that this was not just another charitable project. It was a deeply personal mission that went to the heart of who he was as a person. The first priority was Angelo's immediate welfare and dignity. Manny arranged for his former teacher to stay in a comfortable suite at one of Manila's better hotels, complete with room service and medical care, while permanent arrangements were being finalized. He personally selected clothing and necessities for Angelo, taking care to choose items that were high quality but not ostentatious, understanding that his teacher's dignity was as important as his comfort. Manny also arranged for Angelo to have access to transportation and spending money, ensuring that he could move around the city freely and begin to rebuild his social connections. But Manny's vision extended far beyond simply providing for Angelo's material needs. He had been deeply moved by his teacher's story about continuing to help street children even while homeless, and he wanted to create an opportunity for Angelo to return to his true calling as an educator. Working with his foundation's education team, Manny began developing plans for a new literacy center that would serve underprivileged children throughout Metro Manila, with Angelo as its director and head teacher. The center would provide free tutoring, distribute educational materials, and offer meals to hungry students, directly echoing the kindness that Angelo had once shown to young Manny. The financial arrangements were equally thoughtful and comprehensive. Rather than simply giving Angelo a large sum of money, which might feel impersonal or create tax complications, Manny structured a plan that would provide his teacher with a generous monthly stipend for life, full medical coverage, and a comfortable home in a location of Angelo's choosing. Additionally, the literacy center would provide Angelo with a meaningful salary and purpose, allowing him to maintain his dignity as a working educator rather than feeling like a charity recipient. Manny also began planning something that would ensure Angelo's story and impact would be remembered and celebrated. He commissioned a documentary about his teacher's life and influence, not just on Manny's own development, but on the hundreds of other students Angelo had taught and inspired over his career. The film would highlight the crucial role that dedicated teachers play in breaking cycles of poverty and creating opportunities for disadvantaged children, using Angelo's story as a powerful example of how small acts of kindness can have enormous long-term consequences. As word of Manny's reunion with his former teacher began to spread through social media and news outlets, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of teachers who had made a difference in their lives, and many offered to contribute to the literacy center that was being established in Angelo's honor. What had started as a personal mission to help one man was evolving into a broader movement celebrating the importance of education and the teachers who dedicate their lives to nurturing young minds, even when society fails to adequately recognize or compensate their contributions. 3 weeks after their emotional reunion on the Manila street corner, Angelo Santos stood in the spacious main room of the newly established Santos Learning Center, named in his honor, watching as construction workers put the finishing touches on what would soon become a beacon of hope for underprivileged children throughout the city. The transformation had been remarkable, not just of the physical space but of Angelo himself, who seemed to have regained years of vitality as he prepared to return to his life's calling as an educator. Manny watched from the doorway, feeling a deep satisfaction as he observed his former teacher examining the new desks, running his hands along the shelves that would soon hold hundreds of books, and discussing curriculum plans with the team of young teachers who would work alongside him. The center was everything Manny had envisioned and more. The main classroom could accommodate 50 students at a time, with smaller rooms available for individual tutoring and specialized programs. A fully equipped kitchen would ensure that no child would go hungry while learning, directly honoring the memory of those shared lunches that had meant so much to young Manny decades earlier. The library was stocked with thousands of new and carefully selected used books, including many of the same titles that Angelo had been selling on the street, now given new life as tools for education rather than mere survival. Angelo had thrown himself into the planning process with an energy and enthusiasm that belied his 72 years. He had personally interviewed each of the teachers who would join the center's staff, sharing his philosophy of education that emphasized not just academic learning, but also character development and social responsibility. He had designed programs specifically for street children, understanding their unique challenges and needs in ways that only someone who had recently experienced homelessness could truly appreciate. Most importantly, he had insisted that the center operate with the same spirit of dignity and respect that had characterized his own teaching throughout his career. The media attention surrounding the center's establishment had been intense but largely positive. News outlets across the Philippines and internationally had picked up the story of the champion boxer who had never forgotten his humble beginnings, or the teacher who had helped him survive his childhood poverty. The narrative resonated with people everywhere, reminding them of the teachers who had influenced their own lives and highlighting the ongoing challenges faced by educators. particularly those working with disadvantaged populations. Several other successful Filipinos had come forward with their own stories of teachers who had made crucial differences in their lives, and some had committed to supporting similar educational initiatives. For Angelo, the transformation went beyond the professional satisfaction of returning to teaching. The months of uncertainty and struggle had taken a toll on his health and spirit, but the knowledge that his life's work was being honored and continued in such a meaningful way had restored his sense of purpose and dignity. He spoke frequently about Esperanza, his late wife, and how proud she would have been to see the center that bore his name. He had found new energy not just for teaching but for living, and his enthusiasm was infectious among the staff and volunteers who worked with him. Manny had been careful to structure his support in a way that honored Angelo's independence and professional expertise. Rather than simply funding the center and walking away, he had created an ongoing partnership that allowed Angelo to have real authority and decision-making power, while ensuring that resources would always be available to support the center's mission. The arrangement reflected the same respect and dignity that Angelo had shown to young Manny all those years ago, treating him as a capable individual rather than simply a recipient of charity. As the opening day approached, both men reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. For Angelo, it represented a return to his true calling and a validation that his life's work had mattered in ways he had never fully understood. For Manny, it was the fulfillment of a childhood promise and a demonstration that success was meaningless unless it was used to honor and support the people who had made it possible. The Santos Learning Center would serve hundreds of children in the years to come, but its deeper significance lay in what it represented about the enduring power of gratitude, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds between teachers and students. 6 months after the Santos Learning Center opened its doors, the impact was already evident throughout the surrounding community. More than 300 children had enrolled in various programs, from basic literacy classes to advanced tutoring sessions, and the waiting list continued to grow as word spread about the quality of education and care being provided. Angelo had recruited several of his former colleagues from his teaching days, creating a staff that combined decades of experience with youthful energy and innovation. The center operated 6 days a week, offering not just academic instruction, but also meals, healthcare referrals, and family support services that addressed the complex challenges facing impoverished families. Manny visited the center regularly, often arriving unannounced to observe classes or share meals with the students. These visits had become some of his most treasured moments, watching Angelo work with the same patience and dedication that had once helped a hungry boy survive elementary school. The sight of his former teacher breaking bread with new generations of struggling children never failed to move Manny deeply, reminding him of the cyclical nature of generosity and the way kindness could ripple through time to touch lives that hadn't even been born when the original act of compassion took place. The documentary about Angelo's life and influence had premiered to critical acclaim and widespread viewership, sparking a national conversation about the treatment of teachers and the importance of supporting education for disadvantaged children. Several other learning centers had been established in different cities, inspired by the Santos model and funded by a combination of government support, private donations, and contributions from successful individuals who wanted to honor their own former teachers. Angelo had become an unexpected celebrity, invited to speak at education conferences and policy forums, but he remained focused on the daily work of teaching and refused to let fame distract him from his core mission. The relationship between Manny and Angelo had evolved into something deeper than the traditional teacher-student dynamic, or even a simple friendship. They had become partners in a shared mission, united by their understanding of how education could transform lives and their commitment to ensuring that no child would face the kind of hunger and desperation that had once threatened to derail Manny's own education. Their weekly dinners together had become a cherished tradition, opportunities to discuss the center's progress, share stories about the students they were helping, and reflect on the unexpected ways their lives had intersected across the decades. Angelo's health had improved dramatically since his days on the street, but more importantly, his spirit had been renewed by the knowledge that his life's work was continuing and expanding in ways he had never imagined possible. He spoke often about the letters he received from former students who had heard about the center and wanted to share their own stories of how his teaching had influenced their lives. Many had gone on to become teachers themselves, creating an extended network of educators who traced their inspiration back to Angelo's classroom in General Santos City. As Manny prepared for what many expected to be his final boxing match, he found himself thinking more about legacy and the ways that true success could be measured. The championships and accolades that had made him famous seemed less important than the knowledge that he had been able to honor the man who had helped make his success possible. The Santos Learning Center would continue operating long after his boxing career ended, touching thousands of lives and creating new generations of educated, compassionate citizens who understood the importance of giving back to their communities. On a quiet Sunday evening, as they sat together in Angelo's comfortable apartment overlooking the center that bore his name, both men reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. Angelo expressed his gratitude not just for the material support Manny had provided, but for the opportunity to see the full impact of his teaching career and to know that his life's work would continue through the center and the students it served. Manny, in turn, thanked Angelo for the lessons in generosity and compassion that had shaped his character and guided his approach to success and wealth. Their story had become a powerful reminder that the most important victories in life often happen far from the spotlight, in quiet moments of kindness between individuals who may never fully understand the long-term impact of their actions. The teacher who had shared his lunch with a hungry student had planted seeds that grew into a forest of charitable works, proving that true education extends far beyond academic subjects to encompass the fundamental human values of empathy, generosity, and social responsibility that make civilization possible.